1/3 saying hiring someone who doesn't measure up more costly. Interesting. I'd like to go back to an idea we talked about previously about how leadership is changing and about programs that can be put in place to guide successful leadership. I'd like to speak now with Brandon Roche, the Director of Human Resources for West Marine Products. West Marine is the world's largest boating supply retailers, with over 375 stores throughout the United States, including Puerto Rico and Canada as well. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I know a lot of companies going through these tough times are pulling back. West Marine Products, and you in particular in your position, have been investing in making sure that you develop and retain your top performers. Can you share with us why that's so important to you and some of the things you've been doing?
Absolutely. We had several examples of where we use Caliper, and particularly a 360 activity with our disparate group of district managers and regional managers, our entire store operations management team across the nation, and use the 360 results to really drive us toward identifying our strengths and making certain that we capitalize on those, as well as looking at our weaker areas and how they impact the performance of the overall team. And had not only some great eye-openers, but real empowerment by the leadership group as we came to some conclusions about their strengths and their opportunities for development. And eventually it gave the senior management, myself, very clear direction on how to communicate to that group better, what activities would support them in their growth, as well as the leadership team's performance. And we've really seen a lot of reinvigoration as our district managers and their leadership really holds each other accountable. And what's nice is when people want to make the change themselves, when they realize it of themselves through the 360s as well as their own Caliper scores.
Well, that's really interesting, Brandon, and really very enlightening. And I want to talk a little bit about that because the 360 process, again, very quickly for any of our listeners who might not be familiar, is a way of assessing where somebody is. In other words, how their behavior and performance is perceived and how they come across to others. Some companies do this on an annual basis, but it has to do with a questionnaire that is filled out by an individual's peers, by people who are reporting to him or her, as well as by whoever that individual might be reporting to. And sometimes it also involves clients or customers as well. And then Caliper adds in the in-depth personality profile, which gives you insights into what makes that individual tick. And so you get a really full-rounded scope from an individual as well as you're sharing, Brandon, from a collective perspective in terms of your group of areas where you are coming across well to others and then areas where you might need some improvement. I'm thinking, however, that that's a gutsy thing to do when times are tough, because often when times are tough as a leadership team, you had to make some very, very tough decisions that some people may have disagreed with, and some people might think, oh, maybe we're not going to do the 360s this year. Maybe we'll just skip it. But you didn't. Can you tell me why?
We certainly started with those thoughts. The internal debate we had is this a time to spend money on introspection and looking at the team to see if there's development opportunities? And say one of the revelations that we had in going through the process was we kind of know what we're good at, and when you get into a down cycle, as we and a lot of other retailers are in, those weaknesses, on the other hand, become even harder to get to. And I guess kind of where the rubber met the road for our decision is, are you going to let folks go because you're trying to go out and address weaknesses that you may have never really quantified? Or do you take the time and a little money up front to get to know the team and get to know, hey, here's what we can capitalize on and here's what we need to do different in light of our demands? And I think we made a good decision. It can be very tempting, particularly in a down economy, to say, hey, it's cheaper to just let folks go and worry about it later. Fortunately for me and our company, we are very dedicated to our long-term growth and to the health of our business. So we knew, short-term finances as opposed to long-term growth, this was a good time for us to really look at our mission, and one of them is to invest in our leadership team and prepare for the future so that our customers, shareholders, and associates are all healthy when the economy turns, as we fully expect it will.
That's really well said, Brandon. Having that long-term perspective. And I think also what I'm hearing you say is that leadership always, to me, is that balance between that reflection and action. And what happens during these very tough times is that time in between those two becomes shorter and shorter. So the more we know about who we are and how we come across, the more effective we can be.
Absolutely. We actually experienced that the economic performance required people to become, more motivated or more efficient or capitalize on their strengths. We came to the also realization that the weak areas, on the other hand, the cracks start to show. What we used this for is we had 3 specific initiatives that we were launching throughout our store chain that would ultimately impact about 4,000 employees, and we needed these 30-some-odd people to be our change agents. And that was the premise for our 360 and for our process as we went through the executive review of our Caliper results. We came to some really good conclusions about, hey, if we don't address our thoroughness score and make sure that we hold each other accountable, we have a tendency to get excited about launching things and then get bored and moving on. And that can really spell trouble when you have to sustain a change. We then turn that into action planning. How are we going to maintain our focus on coaching this new behavior? And it was very empowering. I think it was very rewarding for the leadership team to not only kind of have this introspective moment, but then turn it into action plans, turn it into very specific activities that we're really enjoying some of the fruits of all that labor now.
Well, that's so interesting as I hear you say that the team, the leadership team, all shared that one thing in common, that the thoroughness wasn't the strength. From an individual perspective, would you mind sharing with us what you learned and what you're working at in terms of trying to make yourself better as you move forward?
There really are 3 years now that I've been very hands-on using Caliper for coaching and hiring, and more recently for these organizational level activities, has really opened up a lot of doors, not only in a way that I assess individuals or provide coaching and feedback. At one level, the tool's been very powerful because a lot of times people can connect with their Caliper. I can point out behaviors, real concrete activities at work, and then try to bring it back to the scores that they reported when they filled out their survey. And for a lot of folks, again, I think it's just very empowering, and it gives me a lot of traction to provide coaching for folks on work-appropriate specific behaviors that still comes from who they are. There was a manager, and she was exceptional in a lot of categories and very knowledgeable in what she did and how she did it, and was really seen as the person that you could go to get things done. And sure enough, as we kind of went through our Caliper together, her urgency score was very high. And as we started to talk through that and discuss how does that impact your performance or your perception or the perceptions of others when you work, one of the things that she started to realize is that not only in her work life, but even in her personal life, she had that proverbial hair on fire approach to everything. And it really fit who she was, and it reflected her personality, but it also made it difficult for her to kind of get out of the moment and think about long-term plans that could cause her customers to become more manageable. It made it difficult for her to be seen as a coach and development leader, frequently because what's happening now would overshadow growth or things that happened in the past or goals or expectations in the future. And in that specific example, the more that she started to understand that, the more she could start to, what I call, learn some offsets, some skills and some behaviors and some abilities ultimately that she's not necessarily going to change this characteristic of who she is overnight, but she can certainly start to watch for patterns of being what I would call overly urgent. And the most rewarding part is, although this was a very strong personality trait and one that she'll probably always have to manage, she was also very pleased to come back and share with me how she was working differently and how she was starting to enjoy people's interruptions again because she was learning how to manage them better.
That's very good, because a strength can become a limitation if it runs off by itself.
Absolutely. And finding the balance and, and all those characteristics is, I think, part of the fun as a coach when I try to do my development activities is reminding everybody that every part of your Caliper is useful. It just has to do with the situation, the event.
You're in a very unique position, as I'm hearing you talk, because you're part of the leadership team, but you're also a coach to the team. How do you keep both of those hats on or switch them from time to time?
For myself, I think one of the reasons I'm even in human resources is I like the balance of process and organizational problems and, just the running the business activities. At the same time, being able then to relate those processes, those business demands to individual people. That is really empowering when you can better understand your assets, your human resources in any of your teams and departments.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. You did the 360 evaluations in October, if I'm remembering correctly, Brandon.
Yes.
Had you done them prior to that?
We have.
Mm-hmm.
This 360 was our most comprehensive.
Mm-hmm.
We had done our executive management group about 5 years previously. Our merchandising and replenishment group, which is comprised of, I think, about 70 people, had done calipers and some portions of 360s. In this case, they focused on peers and subordinates,
Mm-hmm.
primarily because they're a smaller work group and didn't have as many managers to draw from. We've done 360s for individuals that have asked for them as part of a development and growth opportunity, and some are more prepared for it than others, I guess, depending on how you respond to feedback and criticism in some cases. Some happily will volunteer, others are very reluctant. So at the individual coaching level, we apply 360s really when I think that a person is ready and they say they're ready.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When they're ready to look at themselves and not just from their own perspective, but how they're coming across to others.
Yes, and use that feedback to grow or change or develop a new skill. Because one thing that is frustrating for anybody is to go through that process, learn something about yourself, but then not really have a clear direction on what am I going to do about it. And that's where, if I have a partner, if I have a peer who wants to do 360 primarily because they're motivated to change in some way, maybe they've taken on a new job, maybe they're starting to get a lot of difficult feedback, they're just not satisfied with how things are going, and they're otherwise great employees, that's usually there's that moment of dissonance from where they are and where they want to be, invites an opportunity to identify what's going on and come up with an action plan.
I guess what you also find, Brandon, is that there's certain people during particularly tough times where they step up and they find out something about themselves and then end up acting in ways that, because of the challenge, they might not otherwise.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's exciting is I see that particularly in management, senior management, the really good ones, the exceptional ones, that's what they do. When things are difficult, when the environment is changing on them rather than getting frustrated and blaming others, the ones that I have seen be very successful will use this Caliper process as one of their many opportunities to look at what can I do different, what can I change in order to take this environmental challenge and turn it into an opportunity.
And I also can't help but thinking, as I'm hearing you talk about this, Brandon, that what it is a time when you've got top performers right now, you've got people you want to keep engaged, you want to keep them at the top of their game, and the last thing in the world you want them to do is start looking to take their talent elsewhere. And so by investing in them, you and West Marine Products is making a statement about how important they are to you.
Absolutely. And I believe that personally. I'm the first to also say the personal growth and the retention strategy that goes with it is one of the reasons to do it. But what's been really more exciting and I think more productive for our organization in the last 18 months is using these 360s and executive activities to improve our efficiency, to improve our communication, to improve our performance. In our cases, improve turnover, reduce conflict, better sales in our negotiation team. So I absolutely believe both are important.
You've been great with your time, Brandon. I love the insights and the stories you've shared with us. Before we let you go, is there any advice you would give to a leader in another company who is considering this and right now trying to figure out exactly how to invest and make sure that during these very, very tough and trying times that they do make sure that their top performers and their future leaders and their current leaders know how valued and important they are to them?
You know, I think a couple requirements come to mind, particularly if a company is new or maybe not as invested with Caliper. As a human resources professional, one of the things I know is challenging for me is I need to really be persuasive and convince senior management that the expense is more than made up for by the return. One of the pieces of advice I would give early is that it's not a one-time activity where you'll be able to measure everybody and suddenly there'll be a major change of the dial. What ideally that means is that you introduce the tool at the individual level, probably the leadership level, so that they get a sense of why do these characteristics mean anything? How do I relate them to my business? And what's really great about that is if you can get that far, it's probably because you're giving individual coaching to senior management, the people that ultimately will decide on a larger investment. Then I think you're at a better position to start investing in more and more activities.
Terrific. Thank you very, very much, Brandon.